For years, Western military bases across Africa have operated as symbols of influence and control, raising a crucial question: does Africa truly have no alternative? Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso seems determined to challenge that assumption, but can he endure the consequences of defying the very powers that have shaped Africa's modern history? The ghosts of past leaders like Thomas Sankara, who paid the ultimate price for standing against foreign dominance, still loom large. Yet Traoré appears undeterred. His latest move could reshape not just Burkina Faso's destiny, but the balance of power across the entire continent. Recently, President Ibrahim Traoré made a bold, history-defining decision that has captured global attention. He has aligned Burkina Faso with two nations that have long resisted Western hegemony, Cuba and Venezuela, by allowing their troops to enter and assist his country. This partnership isn't about ceremony or empty promises. It's about building genuine defense capabilities and asserting the right to self-determination. For decades, Western governments have maintained dominance in Africa through military cooperation and economic dependency. Traoré's decision breaks that mold. Much like Cuba and Venezuela, Burkina Faso is choosing to walk its own path, even if it means parting ways with wealthy nations that still view Africa through a colonial lens. And that's exactly what makes the West nervous. This alliance doesn't just threaten their influence, it challenges the entire system that has kept Africa dependent for generations. If Burkina Faso can achieve stability and growth through equal partnerships instead of conditional aid, it could prove that Africa doesn't need Western approval to prosper. And if one nation succeeds in doing so, what's to stop others from following? For decades, Western powers have used assistance as leverage, providing security and financial aid in exchange for political influence or resource access. Traoré's partnership with Cuba and Venezuela signals a dramatic shift, a turn toward relationships built on mutual respect, equality, and sovereignty. Unlike Western countries that attach hidden agendas to their aid, these two nations bring a different legacy, one of solidarity with the global South and resistance against imperial control. The question now is whether the West is ready for an Africa that dictates its own destiny. In European and American capitals, Traoré's move will likely be viewed as a direct threat to long-standing interests. Yet his message couldn't be clearer. Burkina Faso will no longer act as anyone's pawn. This declaration of independence could ignite a broader awakening across Africa, inspiring nations to reclaim control over their alliances and redefine their place in global affairs. So why did Traoré choose Cuba and Venezuela? The answer lies deeper than politics. This is not a random alliance born out of convenience. It is a partnership grounded in shared history and ideology. Both nations have stood firm against Western pressure for decades. They've faced sanctions, blockades, and attempts at isolation. Yet they survived and built systems centered on pride and self-reliance. Their histories echo Africa's own struggle against colonization and exploitation. For Cuba and Venezuela, independence isn't a slogan, it's an identity. They've proven that sovereignty is worth the hardship it brings. Burkina Faso's alliance with them, therefore, is more than a search for military support. It's an expression of solidarity among nations that refuse to bow to foreign control. Through this decision, Traoré is sending a powerful message. Burkina Faso will no longer seek permission or validation from former colonial powers. Instead, it will walk beside those who understand the cost and value of true independence. Cuba's example speaks volumes. Despite facing one of the harshest embargoes in modern history, the island developed one of the world's most admired healthcare systems, one that prioritizes prevention, education, and humanitarian aid. Venezuela, rich in energy resources, continues to push for economic sovereignty in the face of relentless external pressure. Together, these nations bring valuable experience that Burkina Faso can draw upon, lessons in endurance, resilience, and building from within. For Burkina Faso, these partnerships go beyond ideology. They offer practical benefits, too. Cuba's expertise in medicine and Venezuela's strength in energy can help the nation overcome two of its biggest challenges: healthcare and electricity. Cuban doctors are already expected to support Burkina Faso's medical system, reducing dependence on foreign NGOs and aid. Meanwhile, Venezuelan cooperation in energy could help the country achieve long-term power stability, allowing it to invest more in infrastructure and education instead of debt repayment. More importantly, this alliance represents a rejection of the old financial systems that have long shackled Africa's development. For decades, institutions like the IMF and World Bank have extended loans that come with policy strings attached, effectively undermining national sovereignty. According to the African Development Bank, nearly half of sub-Saharan nations remain in or near debt distress because of this cycle of conditional aid. Traore's new partnerships completely bypass that system, replacing debt-driven dependence with cooperation built on shared growth and self-reliance. Cuba and Venezuela's approach emphasizes trade, education, and sustainable development rather than profit extraction. Their goal isn't to control Africa's resources but to exchange knowledge and strengthen local capacity. On the military side, their troops bring decades of experience in community defense and counter-intervention tactics, skills that align perfectly with Burkina Faso's mission to protect itself from foreign interference and internal instability. Naturally, this shift as unsettled Western powers, particularly France, a nation that has maintained a deep military and political presence in West Africa for decades. To them, Burkina Faso's decision represents not just defiance, but the unraveling of an old order. It raises an uncomfortable question: who truly benefits from the continued presence of Western forces in Africa? If African nations can achieve peace and progress through independent alliances, the entire foundation of Western influence begins to crumble. The arrival of Cuban and Venezuelan forces isn't just symbolic, it marks a turning point. It proves that Africa can form partnerships on its own terms, grounded in respect rather than dependency. And that is what truly alarms the West. This alliance could serve as a blueprint for others, a model showing that independence is achievable, that sovereignty isn't just a dream. If this movement spreads, it could transform the balance of power across the continent, challenging the very rationale behind Western involvement in Africa. Of course, history tells us that such defiance rarely goes unchallenged. Western nations may respond through propaganda, sanctions, or covert pressure, branding these alliances as dangerous or destabilizing. But in reality, it isn't Africa's stability that's being threatened, it's Western dominance. For far too long, Africa's push for freedom has been portrayed as rebellion rather than evolution. Traore's decision represents something far greater than short-term politics. It symbolizes a growing movement across Africa, one rooted in dignity, sovereignty, and cooperation. This emerging South-South alliance offers an alternative to Western dependency, emphasizing equality and mutual progress. Studies by the African Union have shown that nations participating in these types of partnerships experience more sustainable and resilient development than those tied to Western aid. Still, Traore's path is not without danger. Standing with Cuba and Venezuela may invite economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and media campaigns designed to discredit his leadership. Yet for many Africans, his defiance resonates deeply. It reignites the spirit of leaders like Sankara, the belief that Africa must own its destiny, no matter the cost. Burkina Faso's new direction could be the spark that lights a continental transformation. If more nations follow its lead, forming alliances based on fairness and independence, Africa could enter a new era of diplomacy defined not by submission, but by self-respect. And while Western powers may threaten sanctions or isolation, this movement has already proven one thing: Africa's story no longer has to be written by its former colonizers, it can be authored by Africans themselves. But perhaps the West's reaction to Burkina Faso's new alliance says more about its own insecurities than about Traore's defiance. If this partnership with Cuba and Venezuela were truly insignificant, why the rush to impose sanctions and apply pressure? The response itself exposes an underlying fear, the fear of losing control. Cuba and Venezuela, of course, are no strangers to economic warfare. Both nations have endured decades of sanctions, blockades, and diplomatic isolation, yet they've adapted. They've restructured their economies, learned how to endure, and even found ways to thrive under constant external pressure. Through these new partnerships, Burkina Faso isn't just gaining symbolic allies, it's gaining valuable knowledge, lessons in resilience, economic survival, and the art of maintaining sovereignty despite the odds. With Venezuela's expertise in the energy sector and Cuba's long-standing strength in healthcare, Burkina Faso is now better positioned to withstand foreign pressure. By improving critical infrastructure and essential services without depending on Western aid, the country is reinforcing its independence from both financial and political manipulation. Slowly, it's building an economy capable of standing tall, even when targeted by foreign coercion. And yet, the West's reaction has been telling. Instead of supporting an African nation's path toward independence, it chooses punishment. That choice reveals a deeper truth. Western powers seem more alarmed by African self-sufficiency than by instability itself. Every act of independence challenges the narrative that Africa can't survive without Western guidance. Ironically, sanctions meant to weaken Burkina Faso may do the opposite, uniting its citizens under a shared belief in sovereignty and strengthening support for President Traore's leadership. If Burkina Faso succeeds in using its partnerships with Cuba and Venezuela to navigate these challenges, it could become a roadmap for others, proof that African nations don't need to depend on Western-controlled aid systems. Which raises a profound question. What if Africa as a whole decided to cut ties with the West altogether? Such a transformation would mark one of the most defining shifts in modern history. For far too long, Africa's growth has been restricted by exploitative systems, resource extraction, unfair trade, and crippling debt that benefit others far more than Africans themselves. Imagine instead, a continent that controls its own resources, its policies, and its future. A united Africa trading fairly, cooperating regionally, and investing in itself rather than enriching others. This vision is not about isolation, it's about empowerment. It's about rewriting the old colonial narrative that insists Africa can't succeed without foreign assistance. Western aid has rarely been free of conditions. Loans that trap nations in debt, adjustment policies that weaken local industries, and trade agreements that protect foreign corporations. Breaking away from these systems would allow African nations to channel their resources into internal growth, building industries, expanding trade across borders, and ensuring that profits stay where they belong, in Africa. Consider Burkina Faso, a country rich in gold but among the world's poorest. Despite its immense mineral wealth, it continues to use a currency printed in France and loses nearly half of its export revenue to foreign benefit. The gold mined by its citizens, sometimes even children, often ends up enriching foreign treasuries instead of local communities. It's a painful reminder of how deeply colonial economic structures still run. This is why Traore's movement goes far beyond ideology. It's about economic justice. It's about reclaiming ownership of what's rightfully African. The belief that Africa needs Western military presence to maintain stability has long been used as justification for foreign control. Yet, history shows that these bases and interventions often fuel division, dependency, and unrest rather than security. An Africa free from these arrangements could finally shape its own defense strategy. By working together, African nations could build a continental security system rooted in unity and sovereignty, not external direction. Instead of being a pawn in global power struggles, Africa could become a player, defining its own rules of engagement and protecting its people on its own terms. Western governments often argue that their influence brings culture, technology, and progress, but this argument ignores Africa's inherent strength. The continent has always been a hub of innovation, creativity, and cultural richness. Its art, technology, and traditions have inspired the world for centuries. Suggesting that Africa needs the West to evolve is a remnant of outdated paternalism. Freed from dependency, Africa could fully embrace its own cultural identity, investing in its youth, innovation, and creativity, igniting a new wave of pride and progress that reflects its true potential. Breaking away from the West doesn't mean closing doors, it means opening new ones. It means redefining what partnership looks like, engaging with nations that respect Africa as an equal, not as a subordinate. The possibilities are immense. Fair collaborations with countries in South America, Asia, and within Africa itself, all based on equality and shared growth. By creating such equitable relationships, Africa could emerge as a united global power, not a dependent region, but a continent of influence, purpose, and pride. And with control over its environmental policies, Africa could also correct decades of ecological damage caused by foreign exploitation. For years, Western corporations have prioritized profit over sustainability, leaving behind pollution and destroyed ecosystems. A self-governing Africa could lead the world in green innovation, developing solutions tailored to its unique climate and biodiversity, setting an example of how development and preservation can coexist. Of course, critics argue that full independence is unrealistic, that cutting ties with the West would lead to chaos or collapse, but such claims underestimate Africa's resilience and overlook the growing movement toward regional unity and self-sufficiency already underway. Africa doesn't just have the means to survive without Western aid, it has the potential to thrive without it. Real progress begins when nations define their futures by their own priorities, by African innovation, African leadership, and African values. Severing exploitative ties isn't about isolation, it's about liberation. It's about choosing equality over dependency and dignity over domination. In the end, Burkina Faso's alliance with Cuba and Venezuela represents far more than a political shift. It symbolizes renewal, a statement that Africa will no longer be confined to the role others have written for it. If this movement succeeds, it could spark a continental awakening, inspiring nations across Africa to reclaim their independence, rewrite their relationships, and reshape their global identity. And that leaves us with the biggest questions of all: is this the beginning of a truly independent Africa? Will other nations follow Burkina Faso's lead? What would the continent look like once free from the weight of Western control? And perhaps most importantly, does Africa really need the West to prosper? Share your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation about Africa's rise, its culture, and its fight for sovereignty. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because together we can help amplify Africa's voice and reclaim its rightful place in the world.